Raise your hand if you've heard of...
Hold on. Who are they going to say? Who are they going to say? They're going to say Tony Timpa. Are they going to say Tony Timpa? Are they going to say Tony Timpa?
Tony Timpa. Raise your hand...
How does he do it? How does he do it? How does he know? These conservatives, they're all the same. They're all the same. I was just sent this video in chat. I just did that mad prediction on what she was going to say. Not that hard of a prediction, actually. Conservatives are all the same. So because of that, because I did a good clip in the beginning, now I feel obligated to do the whole video. So let's begin.
And if you've heard of Victoria Rose Smith. Raise your hand if you've heard of Breonna Taylor. Now, I don't expect everyone to know who all of these names are. That is, unless you're a self-proclaimed activist who's joined the fight against racial injustice, which in that case, if some of these names don't ring a bell, it might be time to start asking why. Hi, my name is Gothix, and today's topic will be covering race hustlers. So what is a race hustler exactly? Well, professional race hustlers are people who incite or promote division and fear-mongering to exploit racial and ethnic tensions in order to advance some personal, political, ideological, financial, or other agenda. Going back in history, you'll find many public figures who've called out race hustlers. Booker T. Washington, a prominent black educator, was one of them. He said the following: "There is a class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they don't want to lose their jobs."
Who does this remind us of? All right, I don't know how this is a critique from BLM.
Race baiting or race agitation can be found in various places, including politics, Hollywood, and the media, which I find to be the most damaging of them all. Going back to my original question, I asked you which of these names seemed familiar. If you were outraged about George Floyd, then you should be equally outraged to learn about Tony Timpa, a 32-year-old man who died by the hands of police officers. Did I mention that the officers were also kneeling on him? But if you look at the coverage surrounding Tony Timpa...
So... hold on.
It's clear that the story wasn't treated in the same way as the coverage surrounding George Floyd. Race isn't mentioned anywhere in the story, and of course, Tony's death didn't spark international outrage.
So the reasons for these things is that, number one, George Floyd was like, the occurrence was literally like recorded. There's a circulating of like a cell phone footage of like a 9-minute video of this person solely having like the life squeezed out of them, which no matter the race is going to spark massive public outrage. Number two, like the killers of Tony Timpa was like held accountable for, you know, the crimes that they did. Now, you know, George Floyd's was as well. Third reason is that nobody, when, you know, Tony Timpa died, were trying to justify it or say that this is like an all right thing that happened, or we're saying, you know, like he was no angel, or, you know, he should have complied, he shouldn't have gone back in the car, he shouldn't have had troubles going in the car, he should have just listened, he shouldn't be on drugs, he shouldn't have broken into that construction site a while back, That's another reason why. And the fourth reason why is that, to our knowledge, there doesn't seem to be an empirical basis illustrating that white Americans have a disproportionate likelihood of having violence enacted upon them by virtue of being white. While the opposite is true for black Americans. There very much seems to be an empirical basis to that. So that's the answer to your question, why George Floyd got a lot more attention than what Tony Timpa did.
Race isn't mentioned anywhere in the story, and of course, Tony's death didn't spark international outrage.
Because race isn't that big of an aspect in the, you know, the Tony Timpa case, while it most likely was in the George Floyd one.
The same can be said about the case surrounding Justine Damon, a white woman who was killed by a black officer. Again, no mention of race anywhere in the story, and no outrage. What I just described,
because there isn't empirical evidence of police being systemically biased against white people,
described to you is an obvious pattern in what I would consider race baiting. When a story involves a black victim and a white suspect, mainly if it's a white cop, journalists make a point to specify that the victim was black. But in the reverse, when the victim is white, race doesn't seem as important. In my opinion, the reason media outlets do this is to incite an emotional response from the public. And because so many black Americans haven't quite abandoned their obsession with righting the wrongs of slavery, I believe that the media finds these folks to be easy prey. And by the way, don't hurt the messenger. I'm just paraphrasing something that Manning Johnson, a black man, wrote in his book. It is a hangover from slavery when the Negro had to depend on the master for everything necessary for his well-being. At the same time, it proves that no proclamation of emancipation is capable of freeing those who do not wish to be free. The Negro intelligentsia, by far and large, is physically free, but mentally slave. After nearly a century removed from slavery, they are unwilling and incapable of throwing off their slave psychology. Red and political charlatans of all shades, aware of this fact, find the Negro easy prey.
So what she's saying here, she's conflating like what she's talking about there. She's saying that that what she's talking about, the like the what's the quote she talks about here, the like a slave psychology, and what she's implying here is that discussing racial biases that exist within policing and within the criminal justice system is a form of slave psychology or whatever that is like enslaving Black Americans to this day, which is a very, 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 very big of a stretch. Like the poor treatment of Black Americans within the criminal justice system is just literally empirically demonstrated. So yeah, check the thing for citations. Okay, nice.
So at this point, knowing what we know about race hustling in the media should pose the question, why? Why do some stories get reported with a racial undertone while others don't? One could say, well, Black people are disproportionately targeted by the police. And in that case, I would ask you to prove it. Because the thing that the media, politicians, self-proclaimed activists, and even data won't tell you is that racial motivation is extremely hard to prove. If all the evidence you have is a white cop killing a Black man, then I would expect every police shooting to be reported in the same way, even if it's in the reverse. Because again,
so it's a good thing then that the basis isn't just on one individual instance of somebody, one racial group of a police killing like a racial group of a suspect. That is not what it's based on. It's based on large empirical analyses of the different treatments of law enforcement and different racial groups. Also, she seemed to be implying there that racial bias is something that's incredibly hard to prove, which, yes, it is, especially when you talk about things like, for example, sentencing and like the cognitive processes of police officers, for example, who are trying to arrest suspects. So the way this works is that she's sort of making the implication here that the only way to conclusively determine whether or not racial bias exists is if it's determined deductively. So if there is pretty much like all other external variables have been like eliminated, there are no other possible variables that can like adjust for this, it is 100% certainly racial bias. And if that's the standard you have for proving things in a sociological context, you will never be able to prove anything ever. Because that's not how the social sciences work. Because there are so many possible, this goes for economics, this goes for sociology, this goes for psychology, because there are 1,000,001 different possible like conflating variables that might affect an outcome, a lot of the assertions that are brought up by social sciences are based on inductive reasoning. So based on, you know, like common trends exhibited in the past, based on reasonable assumptions that we can make, we can inductively reason the fact that it is likely that racial bias is playing some part in these interactions. And that's not a bad thing. That's not like a strong limitation or whatever of things. That's just how this works. For it to not be inductively, for it to be deductively proven, you would need to control for literally every single possible, you know, conflicting variable when it comes to analyzing a social trend. So this can include, for example, how many hours of sleep the police officers got that night, what the suspect was wearing, what the weather was today, what they had for breakfast, whether or not the, you know, police officer had a flat tire the same day and that made them in a worse mood. You know, like 1,000,001 different variables that it's conceptually possible, it is reasonably possible for it to have some level of influence on the outcome of that case. However, you know, when you adjust for the, you know, the most reasonable possible conflating variables, and you adjust for them and you see that there still persists a massive discrepancy, then it is inductively reasonable to assume that racial bias has a part to play in it. So that's the second part of it, sort of the setting the standard for like how you prove things in a sociological concept way too high, to a point where you can literally never prove anything ever if you decide to apply this, you know, this standard to other things that you don't have like a vested ideological interest in claiming that that's not the case.
Again, these two factors don't actually prove racial motivation. Aside from that, there's a matter of selective outrage. I believe that this is due in part to the media choosing to race bait certain stories. Framing a story with a racial undertone is bound to rile some people up, so it's no surprise that there wasn't massive outrage for Tony Timpa or Justine Damon. But Gothix, the reason that there was no outrage with those stories is because the data shows that Black people are getting killed at a much higher rate.
Okay, let's see how she responds to this. Oh shit, she slapped me. Holy shit. Oh my god. Is this allowed? Is this not TOS? Jeez.
I already debunked that in another video, so I need you to stop playing devil's advocate for just 1 second and understand that race hustling has been a thing for years, and this topic always gets deflected as anti-Black rhetoric, which I...
Wait, what? So she just said, she just slapped us, said that I've done this in another topic, in another video, and you're wrong? No. Wait, is that really what you said?
Stop it. I've already debunked that in another video, so I need you to stop playing devil's advocate for just 1 second.
Playing devil's advocate? How is this playing devil's advocate? I hate doing this because it's so cringy, but like... I have personally done a lot of research on this issue of systemic racism and discrimination in the United States of America. I have a document on the topic. Bang. Documenting systemic racism in the United States of America. A lot of interesting stuff here. A lot of interesting resources on the different aspects in which Black Americans get screwed over in American society. And we can go over some of these studies right now if we wish to. This is a very recent one, which is like pretty much like the best you could get to this specific topic, but there are a bunch of other ones as well that are also relevant. So Fagan et al. 2020. A data analysis on 3,933 killings to examine the intersection of race and reasonableness in police killings. They find that across several circumstances of police killings and their objective reasonableness, Black suspects are more than twice as likely to be killed by police than a person of other racial or ethnic groups, even when there are no other obvious circumstances during the encounter that would make the use of deadly force reasonable. They suggest that the addition of training components that specifically address the role of race in an officer's perception of risk and their decision-making in potentially dangerous interactions with citizens may remediate both the incidents of police shootings and their apparent racial and ethnic disparity. So this is just one, a very recent one and a fairly comprehensive one that came out very, that came out recently, like I mentioned previously. But there are so many different ones when it comes to like biases within police, such as just people just perceiving Black Americans as more threatening, given the same body type and the same age, people believing Black Americans are just generally like taller, just generally like more like physically frightening. You can talk about the fact that people perceive them as just more guilty for crimes. It will make that assumption a lot faster. There are just a million and one different like aspects that seem to indicate the fact that there's definitely a racial bias aspect of things. But, you know, hey, she debunked it in her previous video. So I guess I'm incorrect here.
Back in and understand that race hustling has been a thing for years, and this topic always gets deflected as anti-Black rhetoric, which I get it. If the entirety of someone's livelihood was built off of exploiting another person's trauma, I can understand the unwillingness of wanting to address the problem. But like I said, the hesitation to keep that same energy is obvious when we compare the reaction to race.
But there is because it's two different issues. There's still the issue of police brutality and police violence, which yes, something that is addressed and is something that is talked about generally in discourse of police brutality. Then there is a separate discussion about the racial aspect of policing and police brutality. And through that lens of analysis, it is not, you know, rocket science to understand why the case of George Floyd received more attention than the case of Tony Timpa.
Baited news versus news that doesn't emphasize race. This may not seem like a problem to you, but let's consider what happened during last year's peaceful protests. I'm going to trademark that. It seemed like every...
Okay, we got another one. Whoa! What is it? What's this statistic? 96% BLM protests. Peaceful. Was it 96%? Only 3.7% involve property damage or vandalism. In short, data suggests that 96.3% of events involve no property damage or police injuries. And in 97.7% of the events, no injuries were reported among participants, bystanders, or police. Nice meme. Nice meme.
As I said earlier, when the media race baits their news coverage, I find it to be an intentional attempt to incite some type of an emotional response from the public. But realistically...
Congratulations, you have understood media. Your galaxy brain has comprehended the goal of media and the ways by which they seek to accomplish that goal. Wonderful. Great job, Gothix. Phenomenal analysis.
Breaking news is breaking news. So why would a viewer at home believe that they have all the answers to justify a protest knowing that a formal investigation wasn't completed? This was especially true in the case of Jacob Blake, where peaceful protests followed in a matter of hours. Flash forward a few months later, and Jacob saw national television taking personal responsibility for his decisions that day. And if you consider the details surrounding some of the other cases tied to BLM's peaceful protests, you'll find a pattern. Bad choices. Bad personal choices. And although it's easy to blame those choices on the white man system, I believe that true anti-blackness comes from excusing bad behavior and encouraging Black people to avoid self-reflection, which keeps the cycle going. If you're bad...
Who the fuck is encouraging Black people not to do their own personal reflection, okay? This is like literally the argument from individualism. Oh, the only reason why Black Americans are disproportionately like affected is because they make bad choices, just in general. So, okay, we can ask the question. So, time to do the conservative bingo, argument tree, whatever, you know, line of speech lines, NPC stuff. Okay, why do, for example, Black Americans make worse choices? Ding, ding, dun, 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 dun. Let's think about this for a second. Oh, okay. You answered culture. All right, phenomenal. So, where does culture stem from? Dun 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 dun. Your parents. Okay, great. So, who influenced or what influenced your parents and the attitudes they may have towards certain public institutions, the attitudes they may have towards, for example, the workplace, the attitudes they may have towards other groups of people. Dun 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 dun. Wow, it is societal attitudes and biases. Congratulations, you have arrived at the correct answer for why there is differences in the ways people make choices. And the only alternative by that is trying to make the argument that there is something innate about black people specifically that make them, you know, engage in like different choices or whatever, which if you want to make that argument, it's a shit argument, and it's the textbook definition of racist. But yeah, on top of that, trying to make the argument that this is all just because of like personal choices, the massive discrepancies that we see in, you know, today's America when it comes to the wealth disparities between black and white Americans, when it comes to the way they're treated by police, and just talking that up to personal choice is just, it's a laughable notion, really. But yeah, let's keep going.
At your job, you'd expect your boss to give you some constructive criticism. If you're messing up in school, I hope that your teacher would try to help you. So I'm a little confused as to why people can't keep that same energy when it comes to the bad decisions that some people make in life, which could ultimately put them in harm's way. Why wouldn't...
Yes, that is what our discussions around public policy should be oriented around, telling people to make better decisions. Congratulations. Why do we even need, why do we need like laws? Just tell people not to do crime. Tell people to make better decisions. Why do we need like redistribute? Why do we need social services? Why do we need any? Just tell people to not make bad choices, and you've solved the issue. Like, this is just, it's so depressing.
An activist be inclined to help another person better themselves? That's a rhetorical question.
Also, yeah, like Molly said, like literally, even if they make bad personal choices, you know, and we put this into context with the discussion as a whole when it comes to police violence, does that mean that you should get shot and you should get killed by the police for it?
Okay, so now that we talked about the media, let's talk about the activists. And just to be clear, I believe there are two types. Activists that legitimately want to do good in the world but may be ill-informed on a topic. Okay. And then, of course, the activists who exploit racial and ethnic tensions to gain a higher social status or line their pockets.
Okay, so basically implicit in what she said is that the activists, their cause is just ridiculous. That there is no, like, either they're misinformed or they are, like, intentionally malicious. And she hasn't done the legwork preceding this to prove the the assumption there that there is no basis to the, you know, idea that black Americans are discriminated against in the United States of America. So yeah, I mean, that's an assumption she can make, but it's not like substantiated enough within the video that she's making in order to be able to make that a sound argument in this case.
Interesting, because I've been accused of saying what I'm saying just for the sake of making a buck, while the same assertion can't be considered for those who make a living off of victimizing black people. At this point, you should know that I'm not a fan of Black Lives Matter for several reasons. One criticism that I had for this organization is that their donations are processed through Act Blue, a democratic fundraising platform, which is weird to me because I thought the topic of discussion was racial injustice, which isn't specific to one political party. So if it...
Okay. Yes, it fucking is. Okay. If you look at the differences in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party when it comes to like social issues, then okay, even though none of the parties are doing the best they could be doing, or none of them are doing enough, we can still notice a distinct difference in the way Democrats and Republicans handle issues of race and just other like social issues in general. And by that I mean the Democrats are correct and they're better at it.
If it isn't a political movement, then I can't help but wonder why they wouldn't use something like GoFundMe, for example.
If it isn't a political movement, in fact, nobody says it's not a political movement. Nobody says Black Lives Matter is not a political movement. It is a political movement. So what? Does that mean it's bad because it's a political movement? Does that mean they're wrong because they're a political movement? No. But it, like, you know, she benefits of saying, oh, it's political. It's not true because it's political. Can political things not be true? It's not reasonable because it's political. Can political things not be reasonable? I don't fucking know. It's weird.
To take it a step further, where's the money? Has any black person in America seen a single cent from Black Lives Matter? Nope, 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 not you, Sir Major Page, although you'd make a great poster child for a race hustler. I'm actually not talking about the Atlanta chapter of BLM. I'm talking about BLM Incorporated, the organization that spearheaded massive global protests. Where are those donations that Black America so desperately needs in the middle of a pandemic? While you're thinking about it, here's another quote from history.
So I went over this in like another video, like where they put the money. So where BLM donations go. The growth is constant. The foundation has committed $21.7 million in grant funding to official and unofficial BLM chapters, as well as 30 Black-led organizations. It ended 2020 with a balance of more than 60 million after spending near a quarter of its asset on grants, funds, and other charitable giving. 8.4 million on staffing, operating administrative costs. So yeah, okay. It seems like it's going to like a bunch of different organized like stuff, organizations and stuff. But once again, this doesn't refute the central point of like the thing that they're talking about being like a like incorrect or whatever, or like racial bias not being like a significant thing. It's just pointing out one pretty major organization that talks about it in general and tries to like discredit the movements or the ideas behind it based on that, which isn't, you know, necessarily true.
In his book, Color, Communism, and Common Sense, Manning Johnson describes his experience after abandoning the communist movement and explains how communists use certain blacks to achieve their ends. He says, in part, like the Communist Party, the NAACP has collected millions of dollars through the exploitation of race issues. The bigger the race issue, the bigger the appeal, and the bigger the contributions. Yet one cannot find any report of any of this money being spent on jobs, specialized training, or combating crime. It is no accident that the NAACP
so this is like one
dubbed
case.
the National Association for Agitation of Colored People. The record speaks for itself, millions for agitation, and not 1 cent for those things that win the respect and acclaim of other races and national groups.
If organizations do this, fuck them. Then they're wrong. But then there's obviously a difference between Black Lives Matter as a movement and Black Lives Matter as like the like an organization specifically. But yeah, let's just keep
Did you find the money yet? No? Okay. While you're thinking about that, consider this. Why is it that prominent activists such as Al Sharpton, for example, seem to get richer and richer while the same people they advocate for are still broke, even years after activism?
Okay. So you require a slightly different amount of resources for an individual person who speaks for a cause to be doing better off as compared to a massive racial population group that makes up of like is made up of millions and millions and millions of people. You're going to need slightly more resources towards the former than the latter to significantly improve their material condition. But I am 100% against people like using like, you know, messaging that is correct, love like progressive values or whatever, and progressive frames of analysis towards their own monetary compensation. If they do that and people provide proof of it, then yeah, fuck them, they're wrong. But it doesn't have anything to do with the movement as like broader, saying that the movement as a whole is like incorrect or whatever.
Does that not go through anyone's mind? Or how about the black multi-million-dollar celebrities who regurgitate the notion of victimhood and oppression to their fans? We're being hunted in the streets, says LeBron James as he types from his mansion that's specifically not located in the hood. Finally, let's talk about black history and why I consider it to be selective black history. As I mentioned in this video—
So once again, this is another like frame of analysis where like you're kind of like excluding certain groups of people from making decisions. So if you often see this with like left-leaning people. Oh, if you're like rich and you're left-leaning, then you're a champagne socialist. If you're poor and you're left-leaning, then you're just what's it called? You're just jealous or you're just bitter. You know, if you're wealthy and you are, you know, black and you're talking about race issues, then you're just dumb because it doesn't affect you. And you're, you know, speaking tongue-in-cheek, you're not being you're not being genuine. If you're, you know, not well off and you're black and you speak about these issues, then you fall into the victimhood mentality basically, and you should focus on your own personal decision making process rather than talking about broader issues. So it's sort of like a thought terminating cliche.
Booker T. Washington and Manning Johnson are, in my opinion, pretty significant figures that should be talked about more often. If I had to add a few more names to that list, I'd also include the likes of Walter Williams and Tom Sowell. So in terms of black history, why is it?
Oh, we know about Tom Sowell, don't we? Tom Sowell, not his ideas, just they're really bad ideas, both economically and also when it comes to his commentary on racial issues. Once again, just rugged individualism with a complete like lack for like social understanding and intersectionality and the way that, you know, different identities interact with society in different ways.
That these names get passed up, while topics relating to the atrocities of black slavery, Jim Crow, and racial injustice—
because the former are two individual people and the latter are large systemic issues—
seem to be the focal point. Why do historical figures who believe in self-fulfillment or reject the idea of victimhood get little to no attention? I already know the answer to this, but you know what? Here's what Walter Williams had to say. The most damage done to black Americans is inflicted by those politicians, civil rights leaders, and academics who assert that every problem confronting blacks is a result of a legacy of slavery and discrimination. That's a vision that guarantees—
Imagine like believing this, that the biggest damage done to black Americans are like civil rights leaders and academics talking about the ways by which they're disadvantaged in society by virtue of like their like racial identity and the history of you know, like their identity history as well, and not looking at, for example, like literally existence of like slavery, the existence of Jim Crow, the existence of biases within all the different systems in our society. But yeah, the people talking about these issues, they're the real problem here. They're the ones that are doing the most damage, not the actual like issue in itself. It's just a ridiculous
perpetuity for the problems. While we're at it, let's hear what Tom Sowell has to say. Racism is not dead, but it is on life support, kept alive by politicians, race hustlers, and people who get a sense of superiority by denouncing others as racists. And that's pretty much the end of this video, but before I go, I do want to bring up one more point to drive this topic home. Going back to the media's selective and inconsistent news coverage, I'm curious, how many of you have heard about Victoria Rose Smith? Anyone? Well, Victoria was a white 3-year-old girl who was beaten to death by her black adopted parents. Victoria's death came only a few weeks after her adopted mother said this on Twitter: "In my house, my black children get treated the same way as my white children, and my white children get treated the same way as my black children."
Okay, so literally like a Twitter example of somebody.
It's a shame that when they go out into the real world, that won't be the case. Hashtag white privilege, hashtag Black Lives Matter. I don't think it's a mystery as to why the news overlords haven't picked up on this story.
Great, wonderful. One person was dumb on Twitter and then did something illegal, from my understanding, and caused a child to die, which is awful and shouldn't have happened. But because of this means that everybody who talks about BLM or like race issues in general, just like a race hustler who actually doesn't hold these beliefs.
And if I may add, this example shows the stark contrast of those who promote hate and division under the guise of activism. Is this the part where we use the hashtag say her name, or is that reserved just for black people?
They don't get smarter, do they? It just stays at the same low level permanently.